Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us at our Edinburgh DevOps CI/CD demo. We'll just wait a few minutes and then we'll get started just to give people time to arrive, and then we'll start going through the presentation. Thanks. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us and welcome to the Edinburgh DevOps user group. This presentation will be on creating a CI/CD pipeline on AWS and using the various tools to allow you to deploy code in an automatic and safer way and allow you to gain the many benefits of CI/CD and general DevOps practices. Just to introduce myself, I'm the professional services team lead within CirrusHQ. We're an advanced AWS partner, and I also run the AWS Edinburgh UK user group. And I'm also an APN ambassador. So what that means is for Amazon, within the partner network of all the different partners, I reach out to the community and help with different things such as this presentation. And you can see the different AWS certifications I've got there, the most recent one being the machine learning speciality, and some details just about where I am on social media and my blog as well. So in terms of CI/CD, first of all, I just want to kind of define what it is we're going to cover today. So CI/CD is continuous integration and continuous deployment, but also sometimes continuous delivery, which we'll get onto in a bit. So CI/CD is a key part of DevOps, and within DevOps, the idea is that you are closing that loop of your code going through to live and all the different steps in between. So actually creating the code, packaging it up, doing tests, making sure you've got a release, and then configuring and monitoring it. So today we're going to be focusing on getting that code from a repository such as GitHub or GitLab through to actually having it deployed in a live environment so that you can have that automatic release cycle and you can speed up the pace at which your code gets through to live in customers' hands. So just focusing on continuous integration for now. The continuous integration is the process of actually taking the code that you have, whether that's from a branch that one of your developers is working on, a feature branch where you have multiple developers, and combining all that together and then running tests on it or running other processes to make sure that your code actually works. One of the main prerequisites is actually having that version control. Now, the vast majority, as you can see 70% here, is done through Git, but Mercurial and SVN and some others are still in the market, and they still have their uses for different use cases in different companies. So in this particular webinar, we're going to be using Git, but also more specifically GitHub. So we have a repository set up. At the moment, it just has a main branch, which we're going to deploy into, and then have that actually go through to our production system. In reality, you wouldn't have just one branch in a production environment. You would have a development branch and feature branches, etc., depending on how you've got your organization set up and how your developers actually work. Sometimes even with a sort of single person development, it is recommended to use a development branch as well, so that you can test things out and see how that works. Now, if we look here on the continuous integration side, this is a sort of typical setup. We have the main branch, then a development branch that you're actually working on, and potentially feature branches and user branches. Now, the developers would commit to those user branches or feature branches, create a pull request into the development environment, which would then get reviewed and the code would be merged in. Then you would do a pull request into the main environment, and again, it would be reviewed and merged in, and only then would it actually go through to the production. Now, as I mentioned, you could have, at the moment, we're going to be doing straight from the main branch or master branch into the production environment via a pipeline. So that will take the code, package it up, and deploy it onto your environment. But you could also have the exact same setup from your development branch, which is recommended. So you have a development environment which should reflect your production environment, but maybe, let's say, smaller servers or a low number of servers. and that would allow you to actually have your code running on hardware in the cloud or on premise to make sure that your code actually works in the way that it should. So if we focus a bit more on just the continuous integration side, as I mentioned, this is a sort of typical Git setup. We tend to use the Git flow model, which I'd recommend when we send out these slides, recommend you have a look at this tutorial from Atlassian. It really explains the Git flow model in depth. This is continuous integration diagram here is a simplified version of Git flow. It's just using the main and development branch and a feature branch, but the Git flow model is all about making sure your changes are merged in a timely manner so that when you actually go to do your merge to production, you can merge in exactly what you need and you don't end up in sort of merging hell and try to figure out which bit of code needs to go through first, how you resolve the conflicts between developers that have been working on the same area of the system, for example. So the one thing I wanted to just sort of mention is that with this particular model and what we're going to set up today, the deployment from the main branch is an automatic deployment. So you need to make sure that when you have anything set up like this, that you're happy for everything to go live once it's integrated into the main repository. So having those pull requests and having a review process to make sure that the code that's going in is actually what you want it to be, and you want that to go live is key here. So there is ways that you can put like a manual approval step in the pipeline as well, which I'll demonstrate, but in this particular setup, it will be an automatic deployment from that main branch. So on the continuous deployment side, what we'll be setting up today is a pipeline that will take the code from GitHub, then it will package that up and it will then deploy it onto the actual instances. So in a second, we'll go through the different tools that you can use in AWS to do that. But the idea is it will take that code and automatically end up on the production environment without any other intervention. But you can, as I mentioned, you can put a manual step in there so that authorized users are required to go in and approve that step just before the deployment. So to mention, the process for this will be the code's committed, then fetched from the repository, and it can be packaged up or compiled at that point, and we'll go through the CodeBuild process that can be used there. Then the package is then uploaded to be deployed, and then it's deployed onto the infrastructure. So in this case, we are going to be using a virtual machine, an EC2 instance, for our production environment. But with this same process, you can deploy Lambda functions, either using CloudFormation or the serverless application model, or you can deploy into ECS and Fargate if you're using Docker containers. So you can package them up in the same way. You can, with Docker, for example, you can actually run the Docker build and create the actual Docker files and upload them to a repository during the build process as well. So in your code side of things, all you need to concentrate on is getting the structure and the code itself right. You don't need to worry about the actual build process at that point before deployment. So when we talk about CI/CD, as I mentioned, it's a key part of the DevOps lifecycle, and it allows you to make quicker code changes and more regular deployments, rather than having to decide on a release schedule and say, okay, we've done 10 features this month, we're going to package them all up together, roll that out, and then decide from there what's actually going to go live. So having a CI/CD pipeline and having that whole process automatic allows you to release those features as they're ready. And as I mentioned, you don't get caught up in the merging hell of trying to decide what should go live when. It also allows you to automate your deployment process so that once this is all set up, it should just run every time you want the deployment to go. So you don't need to constantly be figuring out, okay, what's my deployment process? how do I get this into live, and going through a lot of complex steps to do that. And that allows you to then focus on the code and make your changes and develop new features for your customers and have them go live in a quicker manner. It also allows you to do the repeatable deployment. So within the code pipeline, each deployment is its own separate action. So if you wanted to repeat a particular deployment again, or you wanted to release the change again that you've done, so say you added more servers and you just want to make sure it's there, then you can do that. You can also add automated testing in. So some of the common uses we've seen, for example, in CodeBuild is to use like some of the testing frameworks like Artillery to make sure, like for example, if an API is responding as it should. So if you know what should come back and you do that test and then it does come back, then you can use that to build up a test map to say, okay, once all these tests are passed, then we can go to the next step. And having the continuous integration model where you are integrating code a lot more regularly allows you to actually do reviews more regularly and keep the code quality there, because if you have a long running feature that you're developing and it takes you months to get through that, then by the time you come to review it, there's a lot there for you to review, and quite often there's quite a number of changes. Whereas if you're doing it in smaller chunks, then you've got that opportunity to review and feedback and improve the code quality earlier, so that later down the line, the code quality is increased because those changes are being fed back and integrated into new developments as well. So on AWS specifically, there's many ways that you can create a CI/CD pipeline. So the way AWS will do it is they'll have a few different building blocks that you can take and build exactly what you need. So an example, oh, sorry. Excuse me a second. So an example of this is for EC2, we're going to be using code deploy, but for something like Lambda or even ECS, you might use CloudFormation to actually deploy the code. So you can use the code pipeline to actually decide what you're going to do and what order you're going to do it in. So these are some of the tools that we will be using. So we'll go through these in a bit more order as well. So code pipeline is your orchestration tool that sort of pins everything together. It's your actual pipeline itself, and it decides what's going to be executed next, and then handles all the moving from stage to stage. The CodeBuild is for actually building the application and compiling it and running anything that you need to package that up. Then code deploy is a system that uses an agent running on the EC2 instance or existing functionality on Lambda and ECS to listen out for any changes that are required, and then it will deploy your code onto that actual infrastructure. The other one here, code commit, is AWS's Git repository. Essentially, that's their tool for managing Git. In this case, we're going to be using GitHub because there's a few more features on GitHub, but code commit will work for quite a lot of cases as well. And S3 in this case is mainly used to hold the artifacts that are required between each step, and I'll explain more on that in a second. So as mentioned, code pipeline is essentially the glue that holds everything together in a CI/CD pipeline. So what that will do is it basically hooks all the different applications together and it determines what's going to happen at each step. So when you have the fetch from the repository, it knows, okay, I need to run the source part. Then it will pass artifacts from there over to CodeBuild, and then CodeBuild will, in this case, it will go to a manual approval step. And within the admin, you can see, okay, I need to approve this. And then the artifacts are passed over to code deploy. Now, within each step, the artifacts themselves are essentially what files you need to move from step to step. So in the Git repository to CodeBuild, that will be the actual code from your repository. Then from CodeBuild to code deploy, the artifacts will be the code that you've packaged up or the files that you need to deploy. And then code deploy will get those artifacts and pass them over to the EC2 instance. So those artifacts themselves are stored in S3 at each stage. So when you're creating the pipeline, it will ask you to create an S3 bucket that's used for the temporary storage of those artifacts. And it will keep previous rollouts as well in there. So as mentioned on CodeBuild, essentially CodeBuild it's a service that runs it's essentially a Docker container that will run an operating system that you can then use to build your environment. So you can set up CodeBuild so that it's an environment that's specific to how your code needs to be compiled. So you can have a Node runtime on there, .NET, Python, but you also have access to the underlying operating system. So you could have a Linux instance there, which then means you can run bash commands, you can install packages. So in the example we've got here, you could have a CodeBuild environment that's got .NET already installed in it, in a Linux environment. You could then install the MySQL client, and using the pre-build phase, so before it executes the build commands, then it goes and grabs the login credentials for your database from something like Secrets Manager, which is used to store sensitive information like API keys, logins, and only certain people will get access to that. Then you build the application and maybe run a database migration script, and then you can use CodeBuild to actually execute that migration script as well through the command line. So during that process, you've packaged up your code, you've migrated your database over to support your new code, and then you're going to deploy it from there. And you can also run a lot of other tools in here. So as I say, it's essentially just a Linux box, and you have access to the command line, so you can run any tools and commands that you need, including things like using sed for replacing file names. So one of the common examples we use is we get a timestamp of when it's run, and then we name the file as the name of the application, and then with the timestamp at the end, so that you get the latest version zipped up in S3. So code deploy itself then is, as I mentioned, it's a service that connects to an agent running on something like EC2 or even on-premise hardware, and it's controlled by an app spec file. So that app spec file, which I'll show you an example of, is essentially it's a YAML or JSON file that has a lot of steps that you can say, okay, so before we do the install, I want to run these commands. After the install, I want to run these commands. And you can use that to control the rate of what's actually happening, and you can install prerequisites, you can stop and start the software that you need. So in this example, we're going to be using Nginx. So we can stop and start that to make sure it's picked up the new changes. And when you're using code deploy, it essentially tries to find the instances it needs to deploy onto. And there's different ways that you can do that. One of them is by getting it to look for particular autoscaling groups, or you can actually have it based on just an instance ID or a tag. So in our example, we're going to be using a tag to do this, so that it can find the particular instance that it's looking for and then deploy onto that. And there are essentially these three main ways of actually deploying the code. So an all-at-once deployment will go through all of the instances that is matched and run the commands on all of them at the same time. You can also use that for blue-green deployment by having it spin up another autoscaling group, deploy everything onto that, and then switch the autoscaling groups over. So you have the old one and the new one run at the same time while you do the deployment. We also have the half at a time, which will take, as it says, half of the instances that it found, do them first, and then do the other half. And the one at a time, where it will go through each instance as it finds it. So in our demo, we're going to be using one at a time because we only have the one instance in this case. So the app spec file, To mention, I'll show an example of this, but the structure of the file is a version number, the files that you want to copy, and you have a pair there of source and destination. So in our case, we're going to be copying all the files over to a specific directory. But you need to make sure you don't use relative paths for that, because it's all from the code deploys folder that's going to be doing this. And then there are the hooks, and this is a list of all the different hooks that you can use, and the ones in bold are the ones that we're going to be using today. So you can have tasks that you should run before the application shutdown, before it downloads the code that it needs to go to, before it actually runs in the installation, then after the installation, after you start, when you're starting the application. And these different stages you can use for different things. So for example, in the before install, we're going to use that to make sure that Python 3 pip is installed. Then after the install, once all the code's on the actual instance, we're going to use that to move some of the files into the right places. So moving the Nginx config into the right place, for example, and then we actually start the application. And on this, I just want to kind of mention that some of the other CI/CD methods that you can use. Some of these you can use on AWS, like that the vast majority of them you can, and some of these are sort of famous ones, and there's a mix here of open source ones where you run your own server and it does all the same sort of tasks, or you have a hosted environment. So like CircleCI, for example, is a hosted option. You can run your pipelines on a container or through a virtual machine, or you can have like Jenkins and have that run as a standalone server. So as I mentioned, we'll send out the slides and all this information will be on there so that you can go through that. And quickly, just before we go into the demo, just wanted to mention CDK, which is the Cloud Development Kit, and that's for defining infrastructure as code and deploying it. That can also do pipelines as well as part of that, and it will generate a CloudFormation template for you and deploy it and then manage all of that for you. And that means that you can do your infrastructure and your pipelines in languages that you're used to, such as like JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, Java, .NET, etc. And there's a good blog there from AWS about how to do this. And similarly, SAM, the serverless application model, is very similar to CDK, but it's mainly for deploying serverless applications such as Lambda, API Gateway, etc. And you use the command line to deploy those applications. So you can deploy them directly to Lambda API Gateway, or you can actually do SAM pipelines as well and have all the same benefits there. And you can connect those up to a Jenkins environment, GitHub Actions, or GitLab. So again, there's another good blog post there on Amazon if you want to read more about SAM itself. And I just want to mention one drawback of using code deploy. So code deploy will deploy to each of the instances that it finds. So each individual one will get that process run and install the code. But that will also happen every time a new instance is spun up. So when an autoscaling group is started, when a new instance is put in there, it runs the same deployment regardless of when it originally happened. So if you deploy some code and then 2 months down the line, a new autoscaling group instance is spun up, it will still get that same process that happened 2 months ago. And that can cause potential issues where third-party repos might not be available. You may have an old version there that's outdated and it's no longer available at all. And it also means that when you're spinning up an instance, you need to do that every time, so it can have some speed implications. And EC2 Image Builder is designed to help with this. So it's essentially a pipeline that has a set of recipes that it goes through, which are code that you can run, usually bash scripts or something similar, to build up your code and anything that you need installed in it, and get to an endpoint and create a snapshot so that you're just deploying that snapshot every time. So you don't need to go through the whole process every time. And it means you have your application then installed. So what we're going to do today, just in terms of our demo, I've got an EC2 instance set up, which has Nginx installed on it, and a UWSGI server, which is we're going to be using a Flask application. So this UWSGI is essentially allows the communication to our Flask application, and Nginx is listening on port 80, and it'll proxy over to that server. So it's a very straightforward application. It's just a hello world application. But in terms of infrastructure, it's listening on port 80, and it'll route the traffic through. So we don't actually have any auto scaling or load balancing here, and typically in a production environment you would, but just to simplify things, we've just got the one instance and it's listening on port 80 for us. And this is the deployment pipe we're going to set up. So it's exactly what we said before. We've got the Git repository. We are going to connect to that using a CodeStar connection, which we'll show you how to set up. Then we'll go through CodeBuild, code deploy, and then finally it'll go to the EC2 instance. So these are the demo steps I'm going to go through. So we'll set up the CodeStar connection to GitHub. We'll create a code deploy application and deployment group. Then we'll set up the code pipeline with the source, CodeBuild, and code deploy, and then that should deploy onto the instance. And once that's finished, I'll make a code change to show you that actually went through. Then all of this will be done manually in the console just now, but I'll also show you a CloudFormation template that has exactly the same thing in it to show that you can use infrastructure as code to do this. And it's now demo time. And as this is a live demo, hopefully this will all go okay. So just before I start on the actual pipeline, just wanted to show this is the EC2 instance that I have. So it is essentially, I've got a domain set up that's pointing directly to this IP address for the public IP, and it's just a small instance. One thing I just wanted to point out that you will need here is you need a role on this instance in AWS to allow the EC2 instance to talk to code deploy. So the role, it literally just has a connection to say you're allowed to talk to code deploy so that you're not getting blocked when you're trying to do any of that. And one other thing that I have set up beforehand is there's a code deploy role for code deploy itself, which allows it to talk to the EC2 instances and auto scaling groups. So this role is just one thing you need to set up, and you just need this AWS code deploy role. So this is a managed policy from AWS. So there's nothing custom in here. This just allows you to actually have code deploy talk to your instance. So in the actual code pipeline, one of the first things we're going to do is set up a connection. Now, I already have the connection set up here, but I'll go through the steps and what you need to actually do. So confusingly, this is a CodeStar connection, but you won't find it under CodeStar. It's actually in this developer tool section. And so if you search for code pipeline and then go to settings, you'll find it in there. So it's a CodeStar connection, but it's not within that area of the console. So when you go to create a connection, you can connect to a few different things, so Bitbucket, GitHub, and GitHub Enterprise Server. Now, on this one, this is going to be using the version 2 of the GitHub connection. So version 1 used to use a token, so you had to generate a token and fill that in. Whereas what this will do is it will install an application on your GitHub, which you can then approve. And that allows you to say, okay, I'm allowing the connection between GitHub and AWS, and you can filter it down to specific repositories. So I'm going to go through the process here, but I won't actually complete this because I already have one set up. But if I create this connection, then what you would do is you click install a new app. Now, I won't go through this just because it's our GitHub, but what that'll do is it will open up GitHub. You then log in and it'll show you, we want to install this app, and list the repositories that you're going to allow it access to. In this case, I've allowed ours access to one particular repository. So I already have this connection set up here, and then I would use that to actually create a new CodeStar connection. So as I mentioned, I already have one of these set up, so it's got this user group connection. So it's connecting to GitHub and it'll show us available here. So within the pipeline, we could just go ahead and create the pipeline straight away, and that would allow us to set up the code build and set up any of the manual parts. But the code deploy section of it, you essentially need to do that beforehand, so and then include it in the pipeline. So that's what I'm going to do just now. So I'm going to create a new application and just go to GW user group application. And then I choose which platform. So in this case, I want to run on EC2. Then once I've got the application, I need to create a deployment group. So then this is where we choose the role that I mentioned earlier on. And in this case, we just want to do an in-place deployment, and we want to look for specific EC2. And I'm going to do this by tag, which is a tag that I've got set up on the instance, which I will show you. So I have this project JW user group, and it's the only instance with that tag. So choose that tag, and it's already telling me you can find one instance with that. In this case, I already have the code deploy agent installed on there, so I'm just going to say don't check that. And I'm going to do the all at once deployment as I mentioned. And we can, when we're doing the deployment, use a load balancer to shift the traffic as it's going through multiple instances. But in our case, we only have one instance, so we don't need the load balancer on there. Now, so that's the code deploy setup. Now, once I've set up the pipeline, I'll show you there are two files that you need throughout this to tell CodeBuild and CodeDeploy what to do. So the CodeBuild needs a file called buildspec.yaml, and CodeDeploy needs another one called appspec.yaml, and that essentially tells it where to deploy things and which order to run in. And I'll show them just in a second. So what I'm going to do is create a pipeline now. So user group, and it's going to create a role for this pipeline for me as well. So it won't actually, I don't need to create the role in advance in this case. And you can choose where an S3 is going to store any artifacts. And you can also use a different KMS key, which will actually encrypt those artifacts while they're in S3. And the source stage I want to use is this GitHub version 2. So this is the app-based version. So we choose the connection that we set up. And in this case, I've got one repository in there. So I've got our example repository, which is this one here and has our application in it. And I just want to use the main branch. And we can tell it if we want to have it deploy the code automatically, which in this case we do. And you can also get it to do a full clone of the repository, so actually include all the metadata, which is useful if you're going to be using like release tags. You can actually get all that information in CodeBuild. So that's our source done. So the next stage is CodeBuild, and what we want to do is, in this case, we want to create a new project. So this is us setting up an environment to actually do the build, and we can put in tags, and we can tell it to only do so many builds at the same time if you have multiple pipelines using the same environment. And you can provide a custom Docker image, but we're just going to use the sort of standard Amazon Linux 2.1, so standard runtime, so it's basically the Linux instance, and we're just going to use 3.0, which is the latest one. And we can tell if we want elevated privileges. We can tell it to create a role for us to actually be able to execute everything. And there's some extra configuration you can then put in here. So you can have a timeout. You can time out the actual build queue itself if you've got lots run through it. You can run a self-signed certificate, run it a specific VPC, and you can choose the size of the instance. So in this case, it's going to give it 3 gig of RAM and 2 virtual CPUs. And you can put in environment variables and different mounts, etc. So as I mentioned, we're going to be using this build spec file. So if we had a file that was named something that wasn't buildspec.yaml, you can override that in here. But in our case, we have a buildspec.yaml that we're going to use. And we can also tell it to log to CloudWatch, etc. So don't need that at the moment. So we'll just create that CodeBuild environment. So that's now created. And you can add in extra environment variables here, but we don't need them at this stage. And this deploy stage is where we use our code deploy and the application that we just set up and the deployment group. So if we go ahead and create that pipeline. So what will happen now is, now that the pipeline is created, it will automatically go through each of the different steps. So you can see at the moment it's in progress where it's actually fetching the code from the GitHub repo. And this will just take a few minutes to go through. So it's now got the code that I've deployed and it's got the last commit. So in this case, I uploaded a CloudFormation template, and we can see you can directly go to the commit in GitHub from there. And now it's actually run through the build process, and if I click details here, you can see that it's going through all the different steps and how long it took to sort of do each one. And there's more information in here about sort of what it's done and all the logs. And let's just go back to the button. So now it's completed the build, and now it's actually going to be doing the deployment. So if I show that, and it's failed. So yeah, this is probably a good one to show that there is a, within CodeDeploy, this error is basically, it's tried to install the files that is required, but there were already files there from a previous deployment I'd done. But because this CodeDeploy didn't do them, it didn't want to overwrite them. So what I've just done is I've actually just removed the previous files. And if we go back into the pipeline, but just retry that phase, then this should actually, it should go through now. Just give this a few seconds. The details, you see that it's now actually succeeded. So it's went through each of the different steps and it's actually installed the code. And this is our application just now. So it's up and running and it's showing the hello world. So that's essentially our pipeline now set up. And if we commit to this, it will go through and deploy again. So quickly, I'll just go through the actual code. So this is, to mention, it's just a Flask application with, it's a default route which says if you go to / with nothing else in it, then it just returns a header with hello world on it, just as a sort of basic test. We use this WSGI just to actually start the application. And then in this config, this is our Nginx config. So we're listening on a particular domain and just telling it to pass over to UWSGI to handle it via a socket. Now, on the build spec, so this is the build spec YAML that's required for the CodeBuild step, and that has to be in the root of your repository that you're passing through. And you can use this command section to actually run any sort of commands that you need. In our case, all I wanted to actually do was copy these files. So I'm not actually zipping it up at the moment, I'm just saying these are the files from the repository that I want to copy over. But we've also got these two sort of full directories. And once that's passed over, in the code deploy, as I mentioned, you need the app spec YAML. So what that's doing is in the file section, it's saying all the files from the source of the repository, I want to move them into this hello world directory. And then based on the hooks that we mentioned earlier, so before we do an installation, afterwards, and then the start, we want to run these bash scripts so that we can do each of the different tasks we need at the stages. So just quick look through those. The dependencies, literally just installing Python 3 pip. Then on the services, essentially what I'm doing is once all the code's installed, I'm copying them over to system directories. So like I'm making sure we have the hello world service. So this is the UWSGI service running. And for Nginx, we have it in sites available, and we have a symlink to sites enabled. And just making sure that everything's owned by www. So that's the user that's going to be running it. And then we run the pip3 install, which will actually uses this requirements.txt file just to make sure that we have all the different Python packages that we're going to use. And then start and stop server, essentially just restarting the services, making sure they're up and running. And stop is whenever it has to stop the instance, it will stop the two commands that we're using. So that's a very quick run through of the application. I think the only ones I didn't mention are these. So this is the service file for actually running UWSGI and using this configuration file just to kind of tell it where to start, how many processes to run, etc. So what I want to do is just to kind of demonstrate this is just quickly going to add in a new root in here. So adding a new root, if you go to hello DevOps, then it returns a slightly different string. So just before I commit that, if I go to my domain just now, just to show you, so it should come up with a 404. So now that we've added that in, then I'm just going to stage and then commit that. DevOps. So we commit that to our repository. And if we go back to the code pipeline, you'll see it's already started the pipeline. It's already kicked that off. It saw that commit directly to the main branch in this case, and it's already started that process. So this should just take a few seconds to go through, and then you can see even the commit message that I put in there has shown up. Then we'll be building the environment, and within a few minutes I'll be deploying it. Okay. Just give it a few seconds. Yes, it's actually completed. So if I refresh this, no, this is live demos. This always happens. So it's me just. Our instance is still up. I think what may have happened is I may have had the, see, I've got the CloudFormation version of this set up as well, so that may have confused things. Let me just disable that at the moment. So what I think's happened is I've got a pipeline version of this through CloudFormation, and both of them were up and running at the same time. So I think it's tried to do the set of commands that's required twice and ended up sort of confusing itself. So just let that run through what we should do. Okay. So we're slightly over time, so if there are any questions just now, we can try and sort of get through those. But what we'll be doing at the end of this, we'll be sending out the slides with everything on there. I'll also be publishing all of the code for this example in a GitHub repo that will be publicly accessible. And so you'll have all the templates to deploy this as CloudFormation, and just the sample application so that you can sort of play about with actually deploying it. If you do deploy it, you will need an EC2 instance running, but sort of T2 Micro will be either in the free tier or a few dollars a month at most. And one thing I sort of mentioned is with it, when you're doing the code build, it will actually be, you're only paying for when the actual container is running at that point. Trying that now. Just try this out. Just in case it's anything. No. So yeah, as is a way of live demos, it's something's not quite right. So will I have a look at that just now? I don't know if Lauren, if you've got any questions there that we can go through.
Yeah, we do. We have a few questions. So the first question. Bear with me because I'm not technical. CI/CD with Git flow featuring branching is not easy when non-trivial refactoring is required. Features should be integrated ideally multiple times per day. This is much more difficult with refactored code. How do we deal with such a situation?
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, the Git flow model lends itself more to having sort of main branches, so like your master and your development. There are other ways that you can do it. So as I mentioned during the source page, you can get the full metadata. So you can actually create multiple different pipelines to deploy code based on like tagging, for example. I think what is probably best is actually figuring out how often you're going to be merging code together, and having the repository that you're merging into, the ones that are going to be more stable, having those have deployment pipelines in CI/CD, so that you're not constantly deploying stuff that's maybe not quite ready to be deployed. But you can also, as I mentioned, you can CloudForm this, so you can have it so that you spin up a pipeline for a particular branch, allow it to deploy the code, and then you can tear down that pipeline once you're finished. So if you've got a feature branch you're working on that you want to test out, you can have a temporary pipeline for that and then tear it down once you've actually merged everything into dev and everything's working.
Thanks, Sean. The next question that we've got is, how do we deploy multiple interdependent production executables, and with DB changes on-prem and in cloud, both should be in VPC?
Yeah, so so a second. With this one, yes, the interdependent production ones, this is where you can use the pipelines for this and get it to deploy into the same instance. You can actually have multiple code deploys go to the same instance or the same group of instances. So in this one, for example, I've got a particular code deploy with its app spec, and it tells you what's going to be installed. But you can actually put in another stage that runs alongside this to run a different application and have that be deployed onto the instance at the same time, and they'll be going to different areas of the system. The DB changes part, you could do that during the code build step, or if there's another command you want to execute, you can add a stage in essentially to do whatever you need. So like if I edit this just now and add a stage, just put as a test, the action groups that you put in here, you can do a lot of different things in here. So you can actually run a Lambda to get it to actually go and execute something, or you can deploy CloudFormation, you can have your manual approval steps, or you can use CodeBuild to actually run those commands that you need and have all of that lined up, either running at the same time. So like if I edit the stage here, I can add a separate action that happens at the same time. So you can line them up like that and have all the things deployed in order you need to, and then have your approval step after that. Hopefully that answers the question.
That's great, thank you. And the final question that we have is, can SonarQube be deployed directly inside an AWS CI/CD pipeline or on-prem inside VPC? Yep,
you can do either really. What I've seen people do is within the build step, actually have the build environment have SonarQube installed and run the tests from within there. Or if you've got something set up on-prem and if it's externally accessible, you can use the build step to run commands within your on-premise or have a Lambda run and connect to that. So essentially each of these stages are blank steps that you can actually do whatever you need to, whether that's calling out to another function or running something within the build environment you've got. Because as I say, it's essentially, in our case, it's a Linux environment, but you can have a Docker container running there. You can have anything you want, so that you can, as long as you're basically passing something at the end of it to say everything's fine and there's no errors during that process, then it will continue to the next step. If you have an error, so like if a Linux command returns with an exit1, for example, then it will stop the pipeline, and then you can fix it and go ahead from there. Cool.
Okay, thanks, Sean. That last question.
Cool. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming, and I hope that's been useful. And as I say, in the next few days, we'll send out the slides and the repository with all the information in there, and hopefully you can get some use out of that. Thanks everyone. That's